When the English court of the 16th century is mentioned, one often thinks of velvet-draped halls, noblemen in stiff collars, and monarchs dispensing divine justice like overzealous wedding favors. What most people don't imagine is a foreign princess arriving at court and flat out refusing to kneel before the king. But that's precisely what happened in the year 1540, when Christina of Denmark, then just 17, was summoned to England as a potential bride for none other than Henry VIII, a monarch whose marital track record was already less than promising. By this time, Henry had divorced one wife, beheaded another, and sent the third to an early grave via childbirth. Complications. You could argue that Christina's reluctance was less rebellion and more basic survival instinct. Christina of Denmark had been born into nobility, yes, but more importantly, she had been born with what contemporaries called a Roman nose and a steel spine. Widowed at the age of 16, after a brief marriage to the Duke of Milan, Christina had already endured enough court intrigue to fill a Venetian opera, and she had no interest in becoming wife number 4 in Henry's Tudor-themed reality show. But Henry, recently mourning the death of Jane Seymour, was on the hunt again. More accurately, his advisors were. A queen wasn't just a companion, she was political glue, a mother-to-be of future kings, and occasionally a chess piece to align kingdoms. Christina, with her impeccable lineage and unfortunate availability, fit the mold. Hans Holbein the Younger, a painter with a flair for flattery and deadlines, was dispatched to Brussels to capture her likeness. Christina posed reluctantly, wearing a black gown of mourning and an expression that suggested she would rather be anywhere else, perhaps even a nunnery. When the portrait returned to England, Henry was reportedly enchanted. "If I must wed again," he allegedly declared, "let it be to her." But Christina wasn't similarly smitten. Her supposed response has since become the stuff of legend. "If I had 2 heads, I would gladly offer one to the King of England." Whether she said it or not, the statement perfectly captured the diplomatic absurdity of the moment. Still, diplomacy required formality, and Christina agreed to meet Henry Sort. O.F. She allowed a private English envoy into her court, where she received him politely, answered questions diplomatically, and gave no indication that she intended to pack for England any time soon. The envoy left impressed, hopeful, and perhaps just a little charmed. Christina, meanwhile, returned to her embroidery with the same calm as someone who had just sidestepped a bear trap. That was not the end of the affair, however, for in the Tudor court, nothing was ever so easily settled. Back in London, Henry's advisors pushed harder. Marrying Christina could secure an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. The portrait of her hung in Whitehall like a tantalizing prize. Even Henry, who typically lost interest quickly, remained oddly fixated. Plans were drafted. Letters were sent. Rumors whispered through palace corridors like tobacco smoke. And then silence. Christina, or more likely her powerful aunt, the Dowager Queen Mary of Hungary, decided against the match. Officially, the reason was political neutrality. Unofficially, it was likely because they didn't want the young Duchess to wind up headless. Henry did not take the rejection well. In the months that followed, he married Anne of Cleves, a disaster so spectacular it deserves its own bedtime horror story, and then promptly annulled that marriage and married Catherine Howard, who would also be beheaded 2 years later. Christina, meanwhile, returned to Denmark and lived a long life filled with politics, regency, and 0 decapitations. She managed her estates, weathered the wars of succession, and retained her reputation as one of the more shrewd players in the European royal circuit. But her brief flirtation with the English crown became legend. To some, she was a defiant young woman who chose autonomy over influence. To others, she was the one who got away England's might-have-been queen, who read the signs and wisely walked in the opposite direction. Still, her portrait remained. In England, a silent witness to what could have been. Holbein's painting, once used to lure her into a marriage, would outlive them all. In it, she looks out with composed detachment, lips pressed together in modest grief, but eyes that seem to say, "I know exactly what you're trying to do, and no, thank you." In another version of history, perhaps Christina marries Henry. Perhaps she charms him, tempers him, and changes the course of English succession. But that's not the story we're telling. Ours is not the tale of a queen crowned, but of one who quietly and wisely said no. Yet Christina's story didn't end with Henry. Far from it. Her life would brush up against pirates, Protestant, revolutions, and even another king with questionable intentions. Because in the world of dynastic politics, one refusal often leads to another proposition, and some princesses find themselves dodging proposals the way knights dodge arrows, which is where we pick up next. After Christina of Denmark's graceful sidestep of King Henry, eights offer an act that might be described as the most elegant diplomatic dodge in Tudor history. One might assume her life settled into quiet nobility. But no, Christina was not the sort of woman to vanish into the embroidered tapestry of history. If anything, her refusal lit a signal fire, and royal courts from the Baltic to the Bosporus turned their heads to watch the young duchess who dared say no. To a king, her aunt, Mary of Hungary, governess of the Netherlands, and sister to Emperor Charles V, understood the value of a woman who could both attract and repel powerful men. Christina was, after all, not just a pretty widow. She was a political chess piece, and Mary, ever the grandmaster, was not done moving her across Europe's board. The year was 1541, and the continent was still reeling from tremors left by the Reformation. The Holy Roman Empire, already a patchwork of loyalties, religious rifts, and Germanic ambition, needed calm, cohesion, and clever matches. Christina, with her Habsburg blood and Milanese dowry, was a rare asset. Rumors flew across the Alps. Would she marry a French duke? A Polish prince? Even the aging Doge of Venice was whispered to have sent subtle inquiries. But one name surfaced again and again, as inevitable as gravity. Francis I of France. Now, Francis wasn't available himself. He was quite busy pursuing conquests, rivaling Henry, and nursing his gout, but he had sons. Several, in fact. And Christina, with her well-documented composure and infamous portrait, seemed a suitable bride for the Dauphin. There was one problem: religion. France, though Catholic, was under a crown increasingly wary of Habsburg influence. Christina, niece of Emperor Charles V, was as much a representative of the empire as she was a duchess. Marrying her into the French court would be like inviting a fox to stay in her dovecote. Charming, clever, likely dangerous. Christina, for her part, was aware of this. She had no intention of becoming a queen in name and a spy in practice. Still, she played her role, gracious, measured, slightly amused. She learned to flatter without offering, to suggest interest without committing. In short, she perfected the art of courtly evasion. And then, in 1545, came a marriage proposal that turned heads even in jaded Vienna. René of Chalon, Prince of Orange, cousin to Charles V, and the sole heir to a vast and strategic cluster of holdings across the Low Countries, made his move. René was young, ambitious, and quite unlike the usual candidates paraded before noble widows. He was also Protestant-leaning, a fact that didn't escape Christina's notice. They met quietly, away from the great halls and public ceremonies. Their conversations were said to be warm and witty, filled with politics, poetry, and the occasional joke about English kings and their matrimonial graveyards. It was the first match in which Christina had some say. And yet, just as momentum gathered, fate intervened. René died suddenly in 1544 at the siege of Saint-Désir. Some whispered poison, others an unlucky musket wound. Regardless, Christina mourned deeply, and not just for her own future. Reine's death created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by his cousin William, later known as William, the silent father of Dutch independence. But in 1545, all that was in the future. For now, Christina was once again a widow in waiting, and Europe, restless and opportunistic, resumed its bidding. That same year, another unlikely suitor emerged, Gustav I of Sweden. Now, Gustav was no romantic hero, gruff, deeply Protestant, and occasionally prone to shouting at ministers during dinner. He saw in Christina not just a political alliance, but a challenge. Marrying a Habsburg duchess would elevate Sweden's standing. It would also drive Emperor Charles mad, which Gustav considered a delightful bonus. He sent letters, then envoys, then a carved Baltic chest filled with gifts, amber combs, a reindeer, cloak, and an illuminated manuscript of Norse sagas. Christina accepted the gifts, admired the craftsmanship, and then once again declined the proposal. By this time, her refusals were legendary. She had become a mythic figure in noble circles, the woman who could not be caught. Young noblewomen wrote poems about her. Courtiers made puns about Christina and chastity. Even Holbein's portrait was copied and sold among the elite, much like a celebrity poster. And yet, despite the romantic fog surrounding her, Christina's life was far from idle. By 1550, she was managing lands in the Netherlands, overseeing finances, resolving tenant disputes, and penning letters that revealed both sharp intellect and unflinching resolve. Her correspondence with Emperor Charles V remained steady, respectful, and subtly assertive. Though he often tried to steer her toward certain alliances, she held her ground. She was no longer the orphan teenager handed off for dynastic purposes. She was a landholder, a regent, and quietly a power broker. Still, history is not without its ironies. That same year, she was called upon to act as regent of Lorraine for her young son, Francis, after the death of her second husband, Francis I, Duke of Lorraine, a man she had finally married in 1547 after years of delicate negotiation. This second marriage, while more traditional, had its own political stakes. Lorraine was a contested duchy, its loyalties split between France and the Empire. Christina's presence there helped stabilize the region. If only temporarily as regent, Christina ruled with an even hand. She restructured the duchy's finances, negotiated with both Catholic and Protestant factions, and introduced laws that would later influence governance in the region for decades. Her court became known for its scholarship, its quiet elegance, and its utter lack of nonsense, that it was during these years that Christina began referring to herself as la veuve volontaire, the willing widow. It was a title worn like armor. She had been offered crowns, rings, alliances, and yet she remained by her own design alone. Not unloved, not unworthy, simply unwilling to be owned. By 1560, Christina had passed her regency to her son and retired to Torpna, a fief she held in northern Italy. It was here that she finally lived in relative peace, surrounded by books, advisors, and the occasional visiting noble curious to meet the infamous Duchess. But she was never far from politics. When her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, was imprisoned in England, Christina wrote letters urging clemency. When the Dutch revolt began, she funded hospitals and relief efforts. And when emissaries visited from France and Spain, they found in her a woman both regal and real, one who had seen kings rise and fall, and had chosen instead to stay seated. In 1590, at the age of 67, Christina of Denmark died quietly in her Italian villa. No fanfare, no scandals. Just the sigh of history closing one of its lesser read but far more interesting chapters. She left behind letters, laws, a few scattered portraits, and an enduring legend. The woman who said no to kings, yes to herself, and lived long enough to watch the world regret not listening. In a Europe built on the fragile alliances of royal marriage, Christina played the game like no other. Not as a queen, not even as a consort, but as herself. And in that rare distinction, she was perhaps the most powerful woman of her age. In the final quarter of the 16th century, while the rest of Europe trembled under religious fires and dynastic collapse, Christina of Denmark sat beneath the lemon trees of Torpna and ruled her small domain with quiet precision. Her lands were modest in size, but rich in prestige. They were, after all, the personal domain of a woman once courted by kings and feared by courts. Though now beyond the fever of youth, Christina had not softened. Age had only sharpened her mind and stiffened her resolve. Her hair, once a deep burnished gold, had faded to silver, but her presence was still regal. Those who entered her court, ambassadors, cardinals, poets, often left with the feeling they had encountered not a duchess, but a living chapter of history. She kept to no particular faction now. With the Habsburgs she was loyal, though cautiously. So, with the French she was cordial, though never warm. With the Pope she maintained the respect due a ruler, but not one bit more. Christina played all sides and owed nothing to anyone. It was said in Italian courts that she had lived so long simply because she knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. But she did speak, and when she did, Europe listened. One autumn morning in 1568, a letter arrived at her villa from a figure she had long admired and pitied, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. The letter was desperate, but laced with pride. Mary had been imprisoned by Elizabeth I of England, accused of conspiracy and treason, and was now living in guarded confinement. She had appealed to kings and cardinals, but many refused to entangle themselves. Christina, however, was different. Mary called her the Duchess who defied kings, and begged for intercession. Christina's response was swift and curt, 2 pages, written in her own hand, sent under seal to Elizabeth's court. In it, she offered neither flattery nor warning, only the blunt truth. What is done to one crownless queen echoes in the ears of all who still wear theirs. Elizabeth never replied, but Christina's words had weight. A message was copied and whispered throughout courts. It reminded rulers that even the fallen were not without allies. It also cemented Christina's image as a matriarch of monarchy, uncompromising, stately, and increasingly dangerous to provoke. Yet for all her reach, Christina lived simply. She rose early, presided over local disputes, reviewed her ledgers, and attended Mass in a private chapel she had built within her estate. She walked the gardens with a hooded cloak in winter and a parasol in summer. Visitors noted that she never carried a fan or mirror. "What need have I for flattery?" she once told a bishop, "when the world already gossips on my behalf?" Still, not all days passed in quiet routine. In 1571, her villa played host to a most unexpected guest, Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate half-brother of her cousin, Emperor Charles V, fresh from his resounding naval victory at the Battle of Lepanto. Don Juan arrived in Tortona on his way to Naples. He came seeking counsel, and perhaps, some whispered, Christina's blessing. She received him on the garden terrace, flanked by 2 greyhounds and a single servant. "You look like your mother," she said, without rising. "And you like yourself," he replied with a bow, which is to say immovable. They dined in private, and though no transcript remains, reports tell of laughter, raised voices, and at least one moment of shared prayer. Don Juan left the next morning, quieter than before. Not long after, Spain entered a deeper phase of conflict. In the Netherlands region, Christina still followed with personal concern. Her son, Francis II of Lorraine, now ruled in Nancy, but Christina remained his invisible tutor, sending advice wrapped in poetry, warnings disguised in fables. He rarely disobeyed her, and when he did, he often regretted it. She had raised him, not just to rule, but to endure. That winter, word came of another death, her old adversary. Henry VIII of England, long gone, was now joined in the grave by his daughter, Mary Tudor. The English throne was now secure in Elizabeth's hands, and Christina remarked dryly at supper, "They crown them quicker than they mourn them." The English ambassador, seated to her left, choked on his wine. But even in her later years, Christina's past continued to follow her. In 1573, a merchant from Antwerp arrived at her gates, requesting an audience. He was no nobleman, no emissary, just a man bearing a trunk, and inside it, a painting. Not just any painting, but the Holbein portrait, the one painted so long ago in Brussels, when she was a widow of 16. Time had yellowed its varnish, but the eyes were the same, calm, assessing, unapologetic. She stared at the painting for a long while. "Return it," she said at last. "To where?" The merchant asked. "To the wind, or the fire, or the walls of a house where no one remembers." But he did not. Instead, the painting remained in her study, a quiet sentinel to a life defined by refusals. And refusals kept coming. In 1576, Christina received yet another marriage offer, this time from a wealthy Genoese admiral recently widowed. His offer included estates, jewels, and an affection tempered by shared maturity. Christina replied with one sentence, "My affections are already pledged to silence." That line would be quoted in salons across Europe for decades. Despite her renunciations, Christina was no recluse. She attended occasional gatherings in Milan, received musicians and poets, and was known to fund orphanages and schools. She had a particular fondness for young girls' education. insisting that daughters be taught rhetoric and mathematics, not just embroidery and scripture. She argued once with a bishop over this matter. "A woman's virtue," he said, "is found in obedience." "No," Christina corrected, "it is found in resistance to ignorance." He did not return yet. Not all resistance could be intellectual. By the early 1580s, the wars of religion across France and the Low Countries had made even Tortona feel the strain. Refugees passed through its gates. Bandits stalked the countryside. Christina ordered her guards doubled, and her chapel turned into a sanctuary. She sent word to her son in Lorraine. Even the quiet corners now echo with war. In 1587, word came of Mary Stuart's execution. Christina received the letter in silence, then dismissed the messenger. That evening, she remained in the chapel for hours. No one dared disturb her. When she emerged, her face bore no tears only. "Steel, she died," Christina said quietly, "because she trusted crowns more than herself." That year, she ceased writing to Elizabeth of England as the 1590s approached. Christina's health began to falter. She suffered from pain in her joints, failing sight, and fatigue that even rest could not cure. But she refused physicians. They ask more questions than they answer, she told her steward in 1590. On a spring morning filled with mist and lavender, Christina died in her sleep. Her death was not marked by trumpets or mass gatherings. There was no royal funeral, no gilded procession. Instead, a simple mass was held in the courtyard of her estate, attended by servants, scribes, a few visiting nobles, and the orphans she had quietly supported for years. She was buried in a marble tomb she had designed herself, modest, square, and carved with a single phrase: Libera in vita, libera in mort. Free in life, free in death. The world, predictably, did not forget her in the years that followed. Christina of Denmark became legend. Painters rendered her likeness in frescoes and oil, sometimes draped in widow's black, sometimes crowned in laurels. Playwrights invoked her name when writing heroines who refused suitors. Philosophers cited her when discussing the rights of women to rule themselves. Even Elizabeth I, aging and unwed, once referenced her in passing. "There was one before me who said no with more grace than most say yes." Christina never claimed to be revolutionary. She did not preach rebellion, nor seek to rewrite laws. But in her refusals, in her deliberate, quiet resistance, she shaped the expectations of what a woman could be. Not merely a daughter, wife, or widow, but a ruler of self. And that, in the Europe of her time, was a greater triumph than any crown. Decades passed after Christina's death, but her name refused to vanish into the footnotes of history. Her life, seemingly quiet and personal, became something more, an emblem. To some she was a patron saint of sovereignty. To others, a curiously aloof duchess who dared speak as an equal to kings. Yet to all who followed, Christina of Denmark became an idea that dignity, when fiercely guarded, outlives power. In 1610, exactly 20 years after her passing, a Swedish ambassador named Bengt Oxenstierna visited Milan. While inspecting archives for diplomatic records, he stumbled across a faded, locked folio labeled Christina, Letter di Ferro, Letters of Iron. Inside were 24 letters written in Christina's own hand, correspondence between her and her cousin, the Emperor Charles V, over matters ranging from land inheritance to the enforcement of laws against unjust taxation. The language was sharp, the handwriting elegant but precise. She speaks to him as a ruler, not a relative, the ambassador wrote in his diary, and he replies in kind. Bengt later returned to Stockholm and shared these writings with his brother, who was part of Queen Christina of Sweden's retinue. The queen was 16 at the time, still newly on the throne, and hungry for female examples of strength. The letters made their way to her hands, and she devoured them in secret. The irony was not lost on her. She bore the same name, and now, perhaps a similar fate, Christina of Sweden would later go on to renounce her crown in one of the most shocking political moves of the century. When questioned about her decision, she reportedly replied, "To rule one's own mind is greater than ruling nations. The other Christina taught me that." Back in Italy, the legend grew. Christina of Denmark's estate in Tortona remained in the possession of the House of Lorraine. But her villa, still adorned with the rose gardens she had personally designed, was transformed into a school for noble girls by her great-granddaughter, Anne of Austria. It was called Casa Libra, named after the inscription on Christina's tomb, "Free in life, free in death." The curriculum was unusual for the time. Alongside religious education and proper etiquette, students studied Latin rhetoric, ancient history, and political theory. A full week each spring was dedicated to lessons on the lives of great women rulers: Theodora, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and most prominently Christina of Denmark. In 1635, the French philosopher Madeleine de Scudéry included Christina in her novel Les Femmes Illustres, The Illustrious Women. In it, she described a scene entirely fictional, where Christina, standing before the court of Emperor Charles, dismisses a marriage offer with a single phrase, "My womb is not your strategy." Though apocryphal, the line spread like fire. It appeared in whispered salons, copied on ribbons tucked inside books, even etched into glass by sympathetic noblewomen across Europe. By the late 17th century, portraits of Christina were fashionable again. Artists reimagined her likeness with subtle exaggerations, sharper eyes, an impossibly upright posture, hands placed atop unopened letters. Each painter projected their own interpretation. Was she serene, defiant, mysterious? But nowhere was her influence felt more profoundly than in England. It was a peculiar twist of history. Christina, once considered a potential bride for Henry VIII, had refused to marry into England. Yet generations later, English women invoked her name as a touchstone in arguments for their own agency. In 1689, Mary Estelle, the early English feminist philosopher, published a serious proposal to the ladies. In it, she referenced Christina in a footnote. "See the conduct of the Danish Duchess, who needed no husband to steady her rule, nor flattery to fortify her soul." Even in the New World, her reputation flickered like a candle in unfamiliar winds. In 1721, a Boston bookseller imported a rare Latin translation of Letter de Férou, which found its way into the hands of Abigail Adams, who later became the wife of America's second president. In a letter to her husband John, she wrote, "There lived once a duchess who said no to power so that she might keep her peace. I think on her often, especially when I watch men quarrel over glory." And still, in Italy, the Villa Tortona stood. By the 1800s. Its roof had begun to cave in, and ivy swallowed much of the stone. The classrooms were closed. The House of Lorraine had long faded from influence. A historian named Paolo Aretino arrived to catalogue what remained. Among his discoveries, a silver hand mirror engraved with a phrase in Latin, non requiro speculum, cum mundus loquatur. I require no mirror, for the world already speaks of me. He wrote in his notebook, in these rooms linger ghosts not of sorrow, but of intention. The phrase inspired the poet Julia Bassi, who wrote an epic poem in 1852 titled La Duchessa che non sposò, the Duchess who did not marry, comparing Christina's silence to a lioness watching from the shadows. The final stanza reads, where crowns lie broken and hearts misled, she walked a path where others pled. She did not yield, she did not wed, but carved her name in stone instead. The Italian monarchy commissioned a statue in her honor in 1871. Placed outside the library of Milan, it depicted Christina standing, book in one hand and a rose in the other, a symbol of her mind and her gentleness. The inscription simply read, Christina di Danimarca, Duchessa e Pensatrice. Christina of Denmark, Duchess and thinker. Later, during World War II, when bombs rained down upon Italy, the statue was damaged, her hand severed, the book shattered. But the rose remained. A young nurse named Elisabetta Moretti, fleeing the bombing of Milan, hid beneath the pedestal of that statue. Years later, she would tell her granddaughter, I survived because a woman who refused to bow stood watch over me. And still, Christina's reach extended in the late 20th century. Feminist historians began re-evaluating her role not as a background figure in dynastic Europe, but as a rare case of a woman who had agency, choice, and the courage to resist. The Machinery of Power. Dr. Helena Munzer, in her 1984 lecture, The Uncrowned, stated, Christina of Denmark did something extraordinary. She said no, not once, but repeatedly. In a world where women were often pawns, she removed herself from the board entirely, and in doing so, rewrote the rules. Today, Christina's legacy is studied in universities across Europe and the Americas. The villa in Tortona has been partially restored, now functioning as a cultural retreat and historical archive. Visitors walk her gardens, now meticulously reconstructed from her original designs. The roses are pale pink. The lemon trees bloom in spring. And at the center stands a stone bench with her favorite quote, carved in multiple languages. What is done to one crownless queen echoes in the fen. Ears of all who still wear theirs. Christina of Denmark left no grand empire, no dynasty, no scandalous memoirs. She left behind something rarer, silence shaped by steel, decisions made in solitude, and a portrait that spoke more loudly than words. A woman born into a web of politics, who spent her life untangling it. A widow at 13. A duchess at 16, a sovereign by sheer will. She married no king. She bore no heirs to thrones. But her legacy lives in every woman who chooses self over spectacle, reason over role, peace over pomp. She was the crown she never wore. The air was dry and smelled faintly of dust and citrus, the scent of age mixed with the last lemons of the season. Deep in the heart of the Christina of Denmark archive, a young historian named Sophia Ulbrecht adjusted her gloves and leaned over. A fragile cedarwood box labeled proprietor, non-CLSSIFICA. She had not come looking for it. Sophia had originally planned to study the botanical sketches Christina of Denmark supposedly made in her later years. Her thesis at the University of Vienna was titled Queens of the Garden. Political symbolism in floriculture of noble. Women 1500 to 1700. She'd expected roses, maybe old soil records. What she found was something far more potent. Inside. The cedar box, wrapped in velvet and bound in aged leather, was a handwritten volume untitled, unindexed. The parchment was thin, hand-stitched, and the script unmistakable. Sharp, deliberate, leaning forward like a woman in counsel. The first page bore only a sentence. These are not letters. These are decisions left unwritten. Sophia gasped softly. Clutching the sides of the box as though it might vanish, it was a journal. Not the kind one keeps to document the day, but the kind written in defiance of forgetting. Here, in ink the color of dried blood, was Christina of Denmark, not as duchess or widow or negotiator, but as herself. The entry was dated March 2nd, 1540. Today the ambassadors from France arrived. They brought fine wine and finer words. But I know the script. A widow makes an appealing prize docile, quiet, grateful. I must remember to smile without agreeing. The night before their arrival, I walked the vineyard alone. The earth was wet, too soft for planting. But still something in me stirred. Not sorrow, not dread, but something like freedom, like knowing the answer before the question is asked. I will not marry the Duke of Orleans. Let that be known not in letters, but in the scent of crushed rosemary on my gloves. When I meet them, Sophia turned the pages slowly, reverently. Each entry was sparse but precise, as if written with the same discipline Christina used to keep diplomats at bay. The ink changed occasionally walnut brown, indigo, rust red, but the tone never wavered. The journal was a map of unspoken decisions. One entry, from 1547, was more personal. There are nights when I dream of my mother. She scolds me for refusing the emperor's counsel. You were born to be a wife, she says, not a whisper among kings. But I wake and find my hands ink-stained and my legs free to walk where I please. I will take no guilt for choosing peace over glory. Let those who sleep beside power taste its poison. Another, from 1553. The painters ask why I sit so still. I tell them stillness is a kind of armor. They do not understand. Let the world look into my eyes and wonder. Was I content? Did I regret? The answer is neither. I was awake. Sophia barely slept that night. She documented each page, cross-referencing the entries with known events from Christina's life. The parallels were astonishing. Diplomats' visits matched with diplomatic archives. Art commissions aligned with letters from Milan. Even a simple note, I wore lavender today, for strength, not softness, corresponded with a portrait. Dated the same month. Christina indeed dressed in violet hues, but it was the final entry that left Sophia trembling. The date, December 27, 1589, the day before Christina died. I feel the edge of things. My hands grow stiff, but not my will. I have refused much in this life, kings, dukes, heirs, and even the comfort of companionship. Let it not be said I was lonely. I was alone by choice. To my heirs I leave nothing of gold. Only this, a life unbent. If one girl reads these words and chooses herself just once, then I have ruled more surely than any crowned queen. The next page was blank. Sophia didn't cry. Until morning. The discovery made headlines across Europe. Unpublished Journal of Alva. Christina of Denmark, found in Tortona archives. Widow who refused Henry VIII, speaks across centuries. New light on the Duchess who said no. The Italian Ministry of Culture worked swiftly to authenticate the journal. Paleographers confirmed the handwriting. Chemists matched the ink to known batches from 16th century Milan. The stitching matched a Florentine method favored in Christina's era. A month later, excerpts were read aloud at the European Parliament's Women's Day Symposium. The chamber stood in silence as the closing line was spoken. A life unbent. The phrase became a rallying cry, printed on posters, tattooed on wrists, graffitied onto stone walls from Lisbon to Warsaw. Feminist movements, long since familiar with queens and rebels, embraced Christina as a quieter kind of hero, not one who broke chains, but one who never allowed them. For Sophia, the moment was surreal. She was invited to speak at universities and international conferences. But when asked what struck her most about Christina's words, she always said the same thing. She made decisions without audience. She didn't need history to notice her. She chose what was right for herself, and that became her monument. Back in Tortona, the villa was transformed once more, this time into a house of reflection, part museum, part sanctuary, part writing retreat. It became a space where women could study, write, and reclaim their own stories. The journal itself was displayed behind glass in a temperature-controlled room. Its presence was quiet, but magnetic. People came from around the world to see the journal. But it wasn't the ink that pulled them in. It was the silence between the lines. One visitor, a poet from South Korea, described it best in the villas. Guestbook. In a world of echoing commands, she spoke only when needed. That's what I want to learn, not just to roar, but to choose when to whisper. 1 year later, on the 435th anniversary of her death, a modern portrait was unveiled in Milan. It was painted not in oils, but in threads, an embroidered depiction of Christina by an international collective of women artists. Each country contributed a detail. Denmark sent silk from Copenhagen. Italy wove in lemon-dyed linen. From England came metallic threads, once used in suffragette banners. In the image, Christina stands facing forward, not as a royal, but as a woman in a simple gown. Her eyes calm, lips pressed into a half-smile. One hand rests on a table. The other holds a quill, the title of the portrait. She refused gracefully. That night, across social media, the hashtag trended. #LifeUNBENT. Teenagers quoted her in graduation speeches. Journalists cited her in articles about autonomy. Nobel laureate in literature opened her acceptance speech by saying, "I write because a woman once chose to be still, and that stillness taught me how to move." And Sophia? She returned to the villa often, always choosing the same seat in the garden beneath a stone arch inscribed with Christina's motto, "Free in life, free in death." Sometimes, when visitors asked about the journal, she would offer her favorite passage, not from the final page, but from a midlife entry in 1555. "Let them say I was difficult. Let them wonder what I wanted. Let them misinterpret my gaze. I am not made of explanations. I am made of choice." She always paused afterward, letting the words settle like dust on marble. Then she would close her notebook, smile, and walk through the rose garden, just as Christina once had, toward a future where decisions were no longer dictated, but chosen. Christina of Denmark never ruled a kingdom, but she ruled her name, her time, her body, her voice. And now, Across centuries, she rules something more powerful still, the reminder that history does not belong only to those who conquer. Sometimes it belongs to those who simply resist, with dignity, with silence, with intention. With a corset unfastened, and a crown unworn. The rain was gentle, barely a whisper, against the tall windows of the Leopold Library. Inside, lamplight warmed the oak tables, where students bent over dissertations and archivists murmured in Latin and German. In a corner near the special collections room, Sophia Albrecht sat alone, her laptop open, but untouched. She was supposed to be writing the final chapter of her book, Christina of Denmark, the woman who said no, but the cursor blinked, and her mind wandered. What remained to say? The journal had already appended her academic life, sparked cultural conversations, and opened international dialogues about power, gender, and silence. The Duchess who had refused kings was now studied in high schools, alongside Cleopatra and Elizabeth I. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that Christina had left one last echo behind. One the world hadn't yet heard. She opened her notes and searched back through the scans. The ink, the line breaks, the slight indents. Christina's writing wasn't just content. It was form, rhythm, shape. A scholar of literature might say it was intentional. A scholar of rebellion might say it was strategic. Sophia, now both, said it was unfinished. She opened the final page again, the entry from December 27, 1589. To my heirs, I leave nothing of gold. Only this, a life unbent. If one girl reads these words and chooses herself just once, then I have ruled more surely than any crowned queen. But then something curious. Below the final sentence was a faint mark, barely a line, not a flourish, not a punctuation. Just a trace of ink, like someone had begun to write a word and stopped. Sophia enlarged the scan, enhanced the contrast, studied it. It looked like the start of a capital letter, maybe a W, or a name, or a verb. And then it clicked. Christina had written, across her life, with measured intention. She did not trail off. She did not scribble or meander. If this mark was real, if it was hers, then she had meant to say something else. Perhaps not to the world, but to the future. To the one girl. To Sophia. The thought felt absurd, and yet she shut the laptop gently and leaned back, staring at the cathedral spire across the street, its gray outline blurred in the mist. She didn't need another page from Christina to finish her book. What she needed was courage, the same kind Christina had drawn from silence. 2 months later, Tortona, Italy, House of Reflection. Sophia arrived without her suitcase. She left it at the station in Milan. All she carried was a messenger bag and the thick manuscript of her completed book, now titled simply Unbent. She was greeted by Elena, the villa's caretaker, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, with an archivist's memory and a gardener's patience. You came back alone, Elena said with a smile. Yes, Sophia replied. This time I came to choose. Elena didn't ask for an explanation. She simply led Sophia to the rose garden and pointed to a bench beneath the arch that bore Christina's motto, free in life, free in death. Sophia sat down and opened her notebook. She didn't write a dedication or a new chapter. Instead, she wrote a letter, not to Christina, to herself. I have spent years studying a woman who said no more times than the world dared count. And in each refusal, she chose herself, her dignity, her name, her silence. The world called her a duchess, but that was only a title. What she really was free. Now I choose. Not to marry the man who says I should stay. Not to return to the post that promised tenure, but took my time. Not to wait for permission to live how I want. I choose the winding path. I choose the shoe. Whisper, I choose the life that is mine alone to narrate. Let them call me defiant. Let them call me quiet. Let them call me late or strange or disappointing. As long as I can call myself whole. Sophia, she closed the notebook and breathed. A breeze lifted the scent of blooming roses around her full, unscripted and very alive. That summer, the House of Reflection welcomed its youngest ever resident, a 16-year-old named Marta from Naples, who came after reading about Christina on social media. She said she hadn't known what history meant until she saw someone walk away from a throne. She stayed 3 weeks, wrote poems every morning, planted herbs every afternoon, left behind a notebook filled with verses and a single message on the villa's blackboard. She didn't rule a kingdom. She ruled herself. So will I. That fall, a woman from Chile donated a tapestry with Christina's silhouette stitched into a field of wildflowers. A mother from Lahore sent a letter saying she'd named her daughter Christina after reading Sophia's book. The journal became more than an artifact. It became a touchstone, a mirror, a guide. And every visitor who walked the villa's corridors passed by the glass case where the final page of Christina's journal rested, still faint, still unclear, that half mark on the parchment, daring each reader to complete it in their own hand. 10 years later, 2025 to 23/5, the movement was no longer a movement. It was an understanding. Quiet choices were respected. Refusals were not seen as failures. Girls were taught to see power not just in noise, but in knowing when to walk away. Across campuses, churches, and cafes, a simple phrase lingered: live unbent. Sophia became a professor, yes, but also a traveler, an essayist, a guest in places where silence had once been mistaken for weakness. She led seminars on Christina's life, but never from a podium. Always from a circle. Always eye to eye. She was once asked during an interview if she thought Christina regretted never being queen. Sophia answered, perhaps, but maybe she also knew that saying no to one throne gave her the space to build her own domain, one of stillness, control, and self-authorship. Isn't that a different kind of crown? The interviewer looked puzzled. Sophia just smiled. Final scene, Tortona. One summer morning, 2040, a girl stands in the rose garden. She's 13. Wears a sweatshirt with live unbent embroidered in silver thread. She's here with her aunt, who donated to the villa after reading Unbent. She doesn't speak much. She reads instead. Her fingers rest gently against the glass of the journal's case. She traces the faint mark beneath Christina's final words. Think she was going to write why, she whispers. Her aunt, standing behind her, tilts her head. Why? The girl shrugs. I don't know. Maybe she wanted us to answer it. The aunt smiles. What would your answer be? The girl looks at the journal again, then out across the garden. And she says, softly, because being myself matters more than being chosen. And with that, she walks on, not loud, not slow, not watched, not just free. Epilogue. Christina of Denmark, died in 1590, that her body was buried in the ducal crypt. But her name? Her name outlived stone. She is remembered not for wars, not for treaties, not even for portraits, but for a question she left behind, and the girls centuries later who chose to answer it. She was 16, tall, sharp around the eyes, carried herself like someone who had been told no one too many times, and had started saying it back. She was visiting from Paris with her mother, who insisted they stop at every museum on the Registry of Women's Cultural Legacies. I just want one afternoon without a lecture, Lee had muttered. Her mother handed her a digital archive pass and left her in room 19. Explore. Or don't, your choice, she said. Lee didn't expect to stay longer than 15 minutes, but she did. The first plaque caught her attention. Christina of Denmark, 1521 to 1590, refused Henry VIII. Charles V and Francis I accepted only herself. Below was an interactive, hollow display. Christina's famous portrait, the one with the black morning gown and the scornful gaze, floated mid-air, rotating slowly. When Lee tapped it, the painting dissolved into handwritten script. Christina's journal. The language translated automatically. They told me my worth was in my womb. I told them my worth was in my will. Lee blinked. She'd never seen a royal woman described like that. Is this real? She asked the archive assistant nearby. Every word. Verified by 3 independent historical databases. Her journal was preserved for over 5 centuries, the woman said. Lee stared at the next quote. They said silence was submission. They were wrong. My silence was defiance, sharpened to a blade. She sat down, and stayed. 2 hours later, she had read the entire digital transcript. All 158 entries, from the young Christina at 13. Writing letters to her dead mother, to the 25-year-old, dodging marriages like arrows, to the 40-year-old duchess. Commanding a court with a pen, to the 68-year-old woman who closed her final journal entry with a mysterious unfinished word. And something shifted. Not just in Lee's posture, in her hunger. All her life she had seen history told through conquest, war, and surrender. But here was a woman who had neither conquered nor surrendered, and had still survived, had reigned quietly, without a throne. The legacy wall, room 19A's. Lee walked to the back of the archive room. She passed a wall titled The Daughters. Who remembered? There were no paintings, no marble busts, just black panels with names and stories etched in soft gold. Each one began with a version of the same phrase. I read her journal, and I left my husband and kept my home. I applied to medical school at 44. I started writing poetry after 30 years of silence. I changed my name. I said no, and this time I meant it. Thousands of stories, all anonymous. All real. Lee stood in silence, and for the first time in weeks, her anger didn't feel like an explosion waiting to happen. It felt like a kindling fireworm, determined and wholly hers. She opened the archive tablet and typed. I read her journal and realized I don't have to become the woman they expect. I can become the woman I am, even if I don't know her yet. She hit submit. Her name was now on the wall. Lee Skrenson, daughter of herself. 3 months later, Aarhus, Denmark. Lee's school held its annual Future Day, where students were required to present something, an invention, a life plan, or a cultural project. Lee surprised everyone by stepping up with a title screen that read, "Unbent. The Life They Didn't Teach You," she began. "They taught us about queens who ruled empires. But they didn't teach us about the woman who ruled herself. Her name was Christina of Denmark. She didn't win battles. She didn't marry kings. She didn't write laws or lead armies. But what she did do was say no and keep saying it until her silence was louder than a crown." The room fell still. Even the teachers, especially the teachers, looked stricken. After the presentation, 5 girls came up to Lee. "I thought I was the only one who hated how much we're told. To shrink. My mother always says don't make a scene, but maybe we should." "Where did you find that story?" "I didn't find it," Lee said. "It found me." Excerpt from a 2096 op-ed, The Atlantic, The Christina Effect, How a Forgotten Duchess Sparked a Century of Self-Sovereignty, by Dr. Irina Mallory. Unlike revolutionary icons of fire and battle, Christina of Denmark's rebellion was whisper-soft. It was internal, strategic, measured. In refusing kings, she claimed the radical right to be ordinary and unpossessed. Her legacy continues not in monuments, but in moments, in the girl who leaves an arranged marriage, the grandmother who starts sculpting again, the refugee who refuses to let trauma silence her future. In a time of surveillance, performance, and curated identity, Christina's ghost haunts us, not to demand power, but to ask, who do you become when no one is watching? Room 19. 10 years later minus 2,105. The archive is busier now. Christina's section has doubled in size. Not because of new documents, but because of new echoes. Visitors can now record a message, leave a note, or light a virtual rose beside the glass case housing the facsimile of her journal. On this day, a woman in her 70s places her hand on the glass and whispers, "I wore the corset for 60 years, and finally I took it off." A teenager behind her hears it. They don't speak, but when the older woman walks away, the teen lights a rose and whispers, "I never wore it, and I won't start." Far future date unknown. Place unknown. A colony ship drifts through the black. Destination New Earth. On board is a digital library containing Earth's most enduring legacies. Included among them, Christina's journal. Archived under Female Sovereignty. Personal Agency. Pre-modern Europe. Its opening entry is encoded with multilingual audio, synthetic paper visuals, and haptic responses. The AI narrator reads aloud to a group of sleeping children in hibernation pods. They told me I must obey to be loved, but I loved myself enough to disobey. My name is Christina, and I belong to no one. The voice fades. And the stars wait. Final note. History remembers the loud, but sometimes, just sometimes, it kneels before the quiet. And in that stillness, across the centuries, we hear a girl in black whisper once again, "Live unbent," and we do. The candlelight in Lady Léonore's chambers flickered against the stone walls, painting trembling shadows that mimicked the unease in her heart. Word had come that the Queen would take communion privately the next morning, an unusual deviation from her routine. To most, it would seem a pious whim. But Léonore had learned long ago that nothing Queen Isolde did was unplanned. She paced barefoot across the rush-strewn floor, the hem of her nightgown whispering like ghosts against the flagstones. Her window overlooked the courtyard, where the moonlight bathed everything in silver. From this perch, she could see the rookery tower, where the doves used for secret correspondence were kept. And just beyond that, the guards on their routine patrol. "I must act before the Queen does," she murmured, turning to her writing desk. With quill in hand, she began drafting a letter, not to her family, not to the king, but to the man she never intended to write again. By dawn, the letter was gone, tied to the leg of a courier pigeon, one of 3 she had hidden from the Queen's spies. It would reach Antonin in 2 days, if the skies were clear. She could only pray he would heed it, but prayer had rarely served her. Next morning brought a cold wind and colder glances in the royal chapel. Queen Iseldine knelt alone at the altar, draped in mourning black, though no death had been announced. The air smelled of incense and unspoken plans. Léonore, standing beside. The bishop watched the Queen's face as she received the host. Her lips barely parted, but her eyes, those glacial eyes, flashed toward her lady waiting like a blade catching the sun. When the service ended, Iseldine did not rise immediately. Instead, she clasped her hands and whispered something to the bishop. He nodded, bowed, and left the chamber. Only then did the Queen speak. "You sent a bird," she said quietly, still kneeling. "To a man I expressly forbade you to contact." Leonore's throat tightened. She'd known this moment would come. The question was how far Iseldine's knowledge reached. Had the letter been intercepted, or merely observed? "I sent no word." "That would harm you," Léonore said evenly. "But you knew that already, didn't you, Your Grace? This is not about treason. It's about control." Iseldine rose slowly, the morning veil fluttering around her pale face. "Treason and control often sit at the same table," she replied, "and I am weary of setting extra places." Their eyes locked. 2 women carved from the same marble, cold, clever, and entirely unwilling to yield. "Your fate," the Queen said, "will depend on whether Antonin brings an army or an apology." She turned and left without waiting for response. Elsewhere in the castle, Lord Armand de Rochiers sat in the solar with 3 scrolls spread before him: trade agreements, tax levies, and a list of bannermen loyal to the crown. His fingers twitched over the seal of House Beaulieu. His own house, once proud, now precariously balanced on the Queen's favor. "Too many names," he muttered. "Too many tongues wagging in the halls." A knock interrupted his thoughts. His steward entered and bowed low. "My lord, word from the northern road. A small retinue, no banners, but led by Sir Antonin de Valcourt." Armand's heart dropped, then rose like a hawk. So he had come. "Prepare a room," he said quickly. "No, not the guest wing. Place him in the tower of St. Alaric." "But my lord, do it." Armand stood and went to the window. If Antonin was at Evero, the game was changing. And in games of kings and queens, pawns had a nasty habit of being swept off the board. Antonin arrived beneath a clouded sky, his cloak damp with drizzle and his horse steaming from the long ride. The guards at the gate hesitated only briefly before allowing him entry. His name still held weight, though less than it once had. The castle had not changed. The stone walls still smelled of rain and smoke. The archers still watched with suspicion. But something deeper had shifted. A current. Beneath the surface, subtle yet undeniable. He was led to the tower of St. Alaric, a clear insult. The tower was used for minor nobles, scribes, and the occasional prisoner too valuable to rot in the dungeon. Antonin smiled wryly. So Armand was playing his own game, no matter. He hadn't come for comfort. He had come for her. That evening, a knock on his door brought a page bearing a note. Unsigned, unsealed, but with a single pressed lilac, their old signal. Meet me in the library. Midnight. The library of Evero was a cathedral to knowledge. But that night, it felt like a confessional. Antonin waited in the shadow of the astronomy shelves, listening to the echo of every footfall. Then, soft as a sigh, she appeared. Léonore wore no corset, no finery. Just a plain dress, a heavy cloak, and that expression he had never been able to resist, defiant and afraid all at once. I didn't think you'd come, she said, stepping into the moonlight shaft between two stained glass windows. I shouldn't have, Antonin replied, but your words still pull me like tides. For a moment, silence. Then she stepped close, and the scent of rosemary and parchment enveloped him. You have to understand, she whispered. The queen is no longer ruling. She is hunting, and I am prey. He cupped her cheek. Then we run. She shook her head. Too late for that. There are plots I cannot name yet, but the court is about to collapse inward. You must be careful. I never was. And that, she said bitterly, is why we fell apart. The words stung more than he expected. Before either could say more, the door creaked open. A figure stepped in. Armand. Well, he said, smiling like a fox who found hens whispering. If it isn't the prodigal knight and the corsetless confidant. Léonore backed away. Antonin's hand moved to his hilt. No need for swords, Armand said. Not yet. I came to propose a truce, one that benefits us all. The queen is losing allies by the hour. The king is elsewhere in every way that matters. It's time new voices took the throne's ear. And you think we are those voices? Antonin asked, incredulous. No, I think she is. Armand pointed to Léonore. And you, Sir Antonin, might just be the blade that keeps her alive long enough to be heard. Outside the library, the storm began in earnest. Rain beat against the tower windows, and thunder echoed like war drums. But inside, a pact was forming. Not of love, nor loyalty. Those were luxuries long spent. No, this was a pact of survival. Léonore, Antonin, and Armand. The outcast, the exile, and the opportunist. And in the shadows of Evero, where secrets roamed freer than servants, survival was the only power that mattered. The bells of Evero tolled a slow, measured cadence that morning, not in mourning nor triumph, but as if to announce a turning of fate. In the courtyard of the Château de Blanchevoix, the old stones held their breath. Antonin d'Amont rode through the gates without a word, his coat still bearing the dust of the road, his gloves damp with morning dew and silence. His return drew whispers like wind through chapel arches. No one greeted him, yet all eyes watched. A footman moved to take his horse, but Antonin dismounted without assistance and handed over the reins. His gaze swept the courtyard too quickly. He was not looking for a servant. Inside, the corridors were changed. Not physically. They still bore the same tapestries, the same flickering candelabras, but something in the air felt rearranged. As though the walls had absorbed too many secrets and no longer had space for peace. He turned a corner and nearly collided with Father Vautrin. The priest gasped. My lord, I had not been told. I came unannounced, Antonin said. Where is she? Vautrin's face tightened. In council, with the Duc de Montreuil and half the court besides. And the bishop. He arrived 2 nights past. That was swift. Almost too swift. Antonin's jaw tensed. She allowed him in? She did not have much choice, I think. The priest looked left, then right, lowering his voice. He came with 100 men, clerics, armed ones. Antonin nodded grimly. He didn't ask which bishop. He already knew. Where are they meeting? The marble hall. And that is where I shall go. The priest hesitated, then stepped aside. You will find a different court than the one you left. I did not leave it, Antonin muttered. It was taken from me. He moved through the halls, like a man stalking his own ghost. Footsteps followed behind him, whispers on velvet. His boots echoed over the polished marble as he approached the grand double doors. 2 guards stepped forward, pikes crossed. Antonin narrowed his eyes. You bar a marquis of the realm? Orders, my lord, one guard replied. No entry without summons. Then consider this a summons. He pushed the pikes aside and flung the doors open. Inside, the marble hall erupted into murmurs. The vaulted ceilings and towering stained glass windows cast long light across the chamber, cooling at the feet of nobles arranged in a loose crescent. At the center, on a modest raised dais, stood Léonore. She was robed in midnight blue, her shoulders square, a scroll clutched in her left hand and a silver quill in the other. She did not flinch when she saw him, but her fingers tightened, almost. Imperceptibly to her left stood the Duc de Montreuil, lips pressed thin. To her right, the Bishop of Rouen, his hat absent, his thin hair caught in the morning light, like cobweb silk. Antonin's boots struck the floor with finality as he approached. I thought the Council of Evreux welcomed all voices of reason, he said. Or has that policy changed in my absence? Lord Daumont, said the bishop, lifting one hand with icy grace. We had not expected your presence. That much is obvious. He turned to Léonore, and for a breath, the hall disappeared. I am glad you came, she said quietly. I could have come sooner, he replied. I didn't, yet here you are. The bishop cleared his throat. If the lovers have concluded their reconciliation, perhaps we might return to matters of state. Antonin turned, slow as thunder. This is no dalliance, your grace. This is the fate of Normandy. And who, precisely, made you its arbiter? No one, Antonin replied, which is why I can be trusted. I have no throne to polish, no diocese to defend. He stepped forward, taking a scroll from his coat. But I do have evidence. Murmurs rose again as he unfurled it. On this parchment, he said, are the names of 3 couriers employed by the bishop's house. One was intercepted near Caen. His satchel contained letters sealed by ecclesiastical W.H. urging noble houses to reject Léonore's petition to convene a court. The bishop's face did not change. Antonin continued. One letter promised an indulgence, another land, a third gold. My lord bishop, tell me, is this how the church now arbitrates royal succession? Gasps followed. The Duc de Montreuil shifted his stance, his eyes flicking to Léonore. The bishop smiled. The parchment proves little. A seal is easily forged. Then, summon the courier, Antonin snapped. He lives. I brought him with me. Silence rippled outward like a stone in a basin. I think, said Léonore, voice low but steel-threaded, we shall hear him. The rest of the council adjourned. into a side chamber while the guards fetched the courier. Antonin remained in the hall, standing close enough to speak to Léonore without being overheard. "You should have written again," he said softly. "I thought I had said enough. I thought you were trying to shame me." "Perhaps I was," she admitted, "but not for leaving me, for leaving the cause. I can survive heartbreak, Antonin. I cannot survive alone." He looked at her then, really looked. The creases of fatigue near her eyes, the stoicism etched into her spine. "You were never meant to bear this burden alone. You knew that once. I forgot." "No. You remembered something else more vividly." Their fingers almost touched Dot before the moment could ripen. The guards returned with the courier, a man in his middle years, threadbare, eyes darting. He was sworn in, questioned, and confirmed Antonin's story to the letter. When he named the cleric who gave him the messages, a hush fell. The bishop's jaw clenched. For the first time, his composure cracked. That afternoon, the council evolved. Evero was suspended until the next day. Léonore withdrew to her private chambers. Antonin stood at her door, waiting. When she emerged, she did not look surprised. "You've come to speak, I presume." "I've come to listen." They sat in the alcove, where sunlight streamed through high windows and bathed the floor in dappled amber. The same place where they once discussed poetry and pretended they did not share a secret. Léonore placed a bundle of wax-sealed documents on the table between them. "Charters," she said. "Petitions. Half a dozen lords now support our claim. The rest ... wait to see who falters first. And the bishop, if the council votes, he will lose. But he knows it, which is what makes him dangerous. He'll not yield. No, but he may yet retreat." Antonin leaned forward. "Then we must give him an honorable reason to do so." Léonore smiled faintly. "You've always been better at war than peace." "No," he said. "I've just learned that peace is the longer campaign." Night came quickly that evening, as if the sun had no appetite for the games of men. Antonin left the chambers late. In the hall, he passed a group of lords murmuring by candlelight. One bowed. Another nodded stiffly. He understood then his return was not just personal. It had reshaped the bored dot in the shadows near the chapel. He caught sight of the Duc de Montreal speaking with a courier. When he stepped closer, the conversation stopped. "Is there news?" Antonin asked. Montreal gave a diplomatic smile. "Merely logistics. Ensuring the kitchens can handle the council's length." Antonin narrowed his eyes. "May I see the message?" The courier hesitated, then handed it over. Antonin read it silently. Brow knitting dotted, it was a notice of armed movement. 10 riders from Anjou, heading for Evero. The seal was not of any noble house, but a circle of thorns. The mark of the silent vow. He handed it back without a word and walked on. But the thought pressed heavy against his ribs. The silent vow had not ridden in generations. If they were summoned now, it meant someone feared the council's outcome. Enough to spill blood. Back in his room, Antonin opened a small case and laid out his old weapons: rapier, dagger, pistol. He had worn them once for war. He would wear them now for what passed as peace. A knock broke the silence. It was Léonore. She stepped inside, eyes flicking to the weapons, then to him. "They're coming, aren't they?" He nodded. "Within 2 days. Then we haven't much time. We have enough." She looked at him, and for a moment The weight of the world sagged from her shoulders. You shouldn't have come back. You shouldn't have had to ask. She smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached her eyes. Outside, in the moonlight, the bells of Evero tolled again. Not for warning, not yet, but for the tension that winds tighter with every heartbeat, a kind of tension that comes before the storm.